Hello, everybody. Welcome to Bonnie's Beat. I'm your host, Bonnie Squires. We're coming to you from Radnor Studio 21 in beautiful downtown Wayne. And our guests that we like to let you know what's going on in the world of politics, academia, the charity world, and bring to you interesting people that are your neighbors that are doing something that's like earth-shattering. And one of our earth-shatterers is with us today in the studio, and his name is Sam Menaged. We'll go into the derivation of his name later. He's the president and CEO of the Renfrew Center. And if you've heard that name, it's because anybody with an eating disorder knows where to go for help. They go to Renfrew. Hi, Sam. How you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, you were telling us an interesting story, George Strimmel and me, the general manager, about the name Renfrew, how you came to name your national enterprise Renfrew.
Well, it was in 1983 that I decided to open an eating disorder facility. I was a healthcare attorney. Out in a law firm in Philadelphia. I then went in-house with the Horsham Clinic, a psychiatric hospital. As a group, we opened a psychiatric hospital in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. We opened a psychiatric hospital in State College, and I was part of the development committee, helping put it together. You know, as a lawyer, you're involved in dealing with the regulatory authorities in Harrisburg.
Oh, that's a joy.
It's an absolute joy. That was the hardest thing to get done, actually. Zoning issues with the neighbors, contractors, architects, reimbursement, whether it's Blue Cross, Aetna, et cetera. To open a facility, you need to get all those things in order. I became aware of eating disorders as a problem from a friend of mine in Boston. I'd lived there for some years, and he grew up to be a therapist. And he said to me, "What are you doing opening these psych hospitals? And you need to look at eating disorders. It's not being served." I said, "What's an eating disorder?"
Yeah.
It was the early 80s. It wasn't in the public eye.
And there weren't any movie stars confessing to be anorexic or have bulimia.
That's correct. There was no People magazine with the covers
Yes.
that say before and after,
Right.
Weight-wise. So I said, "What's an eating disorder?" And I flew up to Boston. I actually went to a support group for women that he had. And I sat in the room, and they had been primed to tell me, "Oh, you should open an eating disorder facility." I said, "Guys, I've just done my research. Mass General Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the country, has a 10-bed unit for eating disorders. Why don't you go there?" And they all said, "Been there, done that." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "It was useless." I said, "What do you mean useless?" They said, "Well, they only deal with the symptoms. They're there if you're a low-weight anorexic to tube feed you and get you up to a normal weight. If you're a bulimic who purges, they'll lock the bathroom to make sure you don't purge. But you never get to understand the underlying issues."
The reason why.
Yeah, or the reasons. There are usually many
Yeah.
factors. So I became aware that this was a serious problem and that something new had to be done, or a new way of treating it. And I met with the group, and they talked about creating a clinic exclusively devoted to eating disorders, that people with eating disorders did not necessarily need to be in a psych hospital or a general hospital, that you needed specific
Place of their own.
place of their own with specific programming that would work for them. This is a roundabout way of telling you how I got the name Renfrew. And I then presented, after doing research for about 6 months, I presented to my board. I was on the board of this hospital chain, sort of, and I said to them, "I'd like to do this. I think this is the next project." And they decided to stick to what they knew. We're going to only do psych facilities. After all, why don't eating disorder people come to a psych facility? I tried to explain the differences. They didn't get it. So I left. I decided I'd spent enough time researching it, and I needed to, I was passionate about doing something different.
And that was very brave.
Yeah.
To
Thank you.
leave. Really
Thank you.
was.
Yeah, I was
You left
young and crazy.
You left a paycheck.
Right. That's exactly right. I lived on some of my savings. I worked out of my little study in my bedroom at the time. I was young and just starting out, and interestingly enough, I looked at a New York Times magazine. in those days, and I think even today, in the back of the New York Times Magazine are luxury homes. They're usually in Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, with acreage and that sort of thing.
In the
Estates.
millions. There's so many
Right,
zeros.
in the millions.
So many zeros.
That's exactly right. But there was in Roxborough, Pennsylvania. Well, they call it Upper Roxborough, on the border of Philadelphia, right on the border with Montgomery County, a 27-acre estate called the Renfrew Farm. And why was it called the Renfrew Farm? Because the family that lived there had originated from Scotland. And there's an area in Scotland called Renfrewshire, and that's where it was derived from. The family were the heirs to the Pennsylvania Railroad fortune. And I remember meeting the woman the first day I went there who sort of inherited this property. And when she was a child, she told me she had 5,000 acres around this house. The Schuylkill Valley Nature Center, the Schuylkill Valley Nature Center, the Andorra Shopping Center. She had 3,500 acres in Philadelphia and 1,500 acres in White Marsh Township, Mequon, etc., all as one big farm. She was in her 80s, and during her lifetime, property got sold off. She donated property to a Girl Scout camp, to the Schuylkill Valley Nature Center, and she was left with these 27 acres. And she was approached by condo developers, real estate developers who wanted to chop up the land. And she said, this is my ancestral home. I want to keep it. Well, there aren't too many people who want a 27-acre estate in Roxborough. If you buy a 27-acre estate, you want to be on the main line.
Right.
So she had trouble selling it intact. And I came to her with this idea, and she was very enamored of the idea of literally the first eating disorder facility in the country. There weren't any that weren't hospitals, or if you had a problem, you did individual therapy once a week, and if you got too acute, you ended up in a hospital. But there was nothing that's preventative in the middle, or that helped you really understand what the issues were. So when I explained to her what I was trying to do, she was very excited about the concept. And interesting little story. Her daughter.
What was her name?
Her name was Eleanor Euston Smith. She was.
As in Houston Hall at Penn?
I believe so. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure. She was, I think, one of the wealthiest women of Philadelphia. I remember her obituary in the Inquirer talked about islands off the coast of Maine that she owned, that sort of thing. Her daughter, interesting story, her daughter was in the room, and her daughter said, "This is never going to work. This is never going to happen. There aren't that many people with an eating disorder." And I said, first of all, I needed a year to put this together. I needed to raise money. I needed to go to the regulatory authorities and everything I'd mentioned before. And the daughter said, "He's going to be back in a year, and we're going to have to sell it again." And the mother turns to the daughter and said, "Do you know that do you remember when you were a debutante and you went to debutante balls? I used to give you a feather to put in your handbag, and you and all your girlfriends would go in the bathroom after dinner and stick the feathers down your throat to purge." And there I realized that it was a serious problem.
Wow.
I knew it was a real serious problem, but the mother then said, "I think this is something that really needs doing." And I said to the daughter, "And I'll bet you some of your friends from back in those days are probably still bulimic or anorexic and are trying to control their weight by this kind of behavior." And lo and behold, 6 months after I opened, in came a woman from Chestnut Hill, a good friend of hers, who ended up coming into the clinic.
Wow.
So that's a long way of answering how I started Renfrew and the Renfrew Farm.
Well, you may have been a healthcare attorney. Where did you go to law school?
Went to NYU Law School.
And Yale undergraduate.
Yale undergraduate.
He was a dummy. What can I say?
And
how did you gravitate towards the healthcare field to specialize in your law career?
Well, when you're in a law firm, many different kinds of projects or cases.
Well, how'd you get to a Philadelphia law firm when you were a New York born and bred and went to NYU?
Well, Norma Shapiro was appointed to the bench, federal bench by Jimmy Carter, one of, at that point, only 7 women on the federal bench in the whole country.
Wow.
Today, I don't know the percentage, but I'm sure it's close to 50 or certainly a third. and she needed a law clerk, two law clerks.
Did you
as a matter
know
of fact.
her? Did your family
Did
know
not
her?
know her. A good friend of mine who worked in her law firm, it was Deckert at the time, recommended me. And I was interviewed by her, and she hired me. And I was shocked and or pleased, I should say. And
She's an amazing woman, Norma Shapiro. Yeah.
yeah, she is. And I was living in Boston at the time, and I moved down to Philadelphia with a 3-month-old and a wife, and clerked for her for a year.
Are you still in touch with her?
Yes, I am. Which, as a matter of fact, she just had her 35th anniversary on the bench.
Isn't that remarkable?
And her 85th birthday party, all in one. And I hosted at my house all the prior law clerks and their families, and we had quite a nice party
Oh, that's
for her.
lovely. Yeah, she's amazing, and she made an impact on the main line before she became a judge, when she was a school board
Yes.
elected official in Lower Merion. Yes, and okay, so you clerked for her, and that gave you contacts in Philadelphia, right?
Correct. And so here I am in a law firm, and I'm working on sort of business law, corporate law. And my law firm happened to have a hospital, psychiatric hospital, that needed work. The kind of work I described
Was a client.
in starting was a client. And I was their outside attorney, and then they hired me to be in-house, because as a company that was expanding, they knew they had a great deal of legal work, and they needed someone to either do some of it in-house or to manage other law firms who would be doing work for them. And that's what in-house counsel often do.
So how long till you decided you were going to start this Renfrew Center?
Well, all in all, I probably was their lawyer outside and inside for about 5 years.
And it gave you a grounding and a background then to see where the needs were and the visit to Boston. But how many Renfrew centers are there today?
Not to be too egotistical, but I can't remember the number. I think we're in 11 states.
11 states?
Yes.
And do you do the paperwork and the legal work for all 11 states?
No, I'm a recovered attorney.
Okay.
And I'm more than pleased to hire lawyers to do the work, which is great. I could manage the legal bills too.
Are they all residential?
No,
the
I
11
have
states, or some
in
day
Philadelphia.
programs?
In Philadelphia, we have 27 acres with 58 beds. In Coconut Creek, Florida, which is right next to Boca, we have a 10-acre site with 40 beds. So altogether, the system has 98 beds. In the old days,
Okay, so that's 2 states, Florida and Pennsylvania. What about the other 9 states?
well, the other 9 states have lower levels of care. So, for instance, if a patient, say a potential patient, has an eating disorder, has never been in therapy before, they'll go once a week. And our clinics in the other states have once-a-week therapy. But if it's a little more severe than that, we have a program called intensive outpatient, which is 3 evenings a week, 3 hours a night. So they would come for 9 hours a week, around dinner time. And so, of course, there's a meal involved. But eating disorders isn't about food, really. It's about control. When life is out of control, when patients or individuals have trauma in their lives, have substance abuse issues. People turn to drugs, some people turn to alcohol, and some people turn to eating disorders to deal with stress. It's a way to control your life when your life is out of control. So you control what you eat or what you don't eat. It's your private little world.
How is it possible that a young, gorgeous, thin, with a beautiful shape, body, woman, looks in the mirror and sees somebody who's grossly overweight and punishes her body by withholding food or throwing up or whatever?
Well, those are the anorexics. And whether you say a perfect shape, there are women who genetically are born with larger bones, larger bodies, and there are those who are naturally thin, you might say. But all in all, there's society's pressure on women to be thin. There's always been more for women than men. Men in the last 10 years, a little more. So look at all the advertisements. You know, you look in a women's magazine, one page.
Twiggy. I remember Twiggy.
That's right. She was the first, and before that, it was Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
So there was this what's called Zaftig look for a while, a little bit of meat on the bones, and then all of a sudden it became Twiggy.
Yeah.
And so women who were trying to follow fashion would try to be thin like her. And you know, the basic thing
But
is,
it's not normal when somebody looks in the mirror and their family's telling them they look skeletal. I mean, they look like a skeleton, and they think they're fat.
but what it is when people go below a certain weight, they have what's called thought disorders. And the chemicals in the brain are such that you can talk to them and say, you're thin, you're skinny, you're this. They don't hear it, they don't process it. They've reached a point, it's below a certain percentage of body weight, usually under 90% of body weight, that begins to happen, that they do not realize they're thin. You can't convince them they're thin. The way people come to Renfrew, when it's voluntary, by the way, is usually they bottom out. Life doesn't function for them. Their hair starts to fall out. They have serious dental problems. They have gastrointestinal problems. So from a mental health problem, they end up having physical problems.
They're destroying their bodies because they're not getting the kind of nourishment and calorie intake that the body needs in order to survive.
Well, also, probably the highest incidence, eating disorders have the highest incidence of death of all mental health disorders. 20% ultimately die. That's the latest 20%. Statistic.
That is a very high.
And that goes for those who are treated or not treated. It's one of the more intractable diseases or disorders there is. It takes specialized treatment, which is why Renfrew was established. To get back to, you talked about celebrities with eating disorders. While I was building Renfrew, Karen Carpenter died. There was a big hole in the ground.
Yes.
I was building this building to house the 58 patients, and she died. And she died of a heart attack. On her death certificate, it says a heart attack, but really she had anorexia. 50% of anorexics who die of cardiac problems, and the other 50% commit suicide.
Oh, my God.
They're so despondent. They're so either not thin enough. Their body image, the way they see their bodies is so distorted, they're never satisfied. And this goes for bulimics as well, who are purging. How do people purge? Obviously by vomiting, but also marathon runners. Those who run, those who exercise hours a day, every day, those who take a tremendous amount of laxatives. That's a way of purging the calories and trying to be thin. What it is with many of them is they're really isolated. Their disorder is holding their life together when, as I said, their life is out of control. And
I can't remember the name of the novel, but one of the main characters was a young woman who was anorexic. And she used to get weighed wearing a terry cloth bathrobe at whatever facility the parents sent her to. But she would secretly put rocks in the pockets. So even though she was losing weight, it didn't reflect that on the scale till somebody figured out what she was doing.
Oh, yeah, it's one of the stigma with eating disorders was so great when we opened that there were very few people who admitted they have the problem. Now, it's come out in the public eye in the last 20 years. People talk about it. But we, at Renfrew, we weigh the patients, by the way, often with their back to the scale so they don't count they don't know their weight.
Right.
But, you know, it's important to us to know that they're being nourished and hopefully gaining some weight if they're anorexic. But they will put weights in their, you know, in their pockets. But we, of course, examine that and make sure that it's a good weight. They fool doctors all the time. MDs out there, internal medicine, adolescent medicine, docs, get no training in medical school about eating disorders. It might be mentioned in a psychology course for half an hour. From the beginning, Renfrew has educated doctors, therapists, communities about eating disorders because it's not always visible.
I want to make sure that we put on the screen the phone number for Renfrew. Here we go. The Renfrew Center, 1-800-RENFREW. That's 1-800-736-3739. And you can Google it at www.renfrewcenter.com. Renfrew is Renfrew,
Yes.
from the Scottish name of the estate that Sam Menaged bought in 1980 what?
1983, and we opened in June of 85 after we constructed a building to house the patients. The manor house on the property is the administrative offices, but we had to build a 30,000 square foot building to house the patients and to have therapy rooms and dining rooms and that sort of thing.
If you have 58 beds, what's your usual census? How many people are usually in-house?
People come from all over the world to Renfrew. As I said, we're the original and we're the largest. We've treated over 65,000 women since we opened in 28 years.
65,000. Dare I ask the recidivism rate? How many are repeat customers? Because when they go out in the world, something happens and they go back to their old destructive habits.
I'll get into that in a little more detail. With the advent of managed care, in 1994 and 1995, managed care came to the mental health field. Prior to that, Renfrew had an average length of stay of 45 days. People had benefits, and Renfrew and its doctors were able to determine what an appropriate length of stay was. That when a patient was on the road to recovery, we could discharge them with proper aftercare plans. All of a sudden, managed care came in 1994, 1995, and our length of stay in 1 month went from 45 days to 10 days.
What can you do in 10 days?
Well, we had to totally revamp our program. And that's when I realized we needed to have these lower levels of care, which, by the way, I did not finish. Not only is there an intensive outpatient program in the evening, those are for people who could work or go to school during the day. We have day treatment from 9 to 3, 5 days a week, with breakfast and lunch and therapy. Now, when we talk about therapy, I didn't get a chance to get into this, but the hallmark of Renfrew is group therapy. Beforehand, like I said, most of these people are isolated.
They suffer alone.
They suffer alone. What we created for the first time is a community of women working together to get better. So, it has anorexia on the door, a sign over the door, practically, obviously not really. And so women come in there and all of a sudden they feel understood. They're in a group of women just like themselves. Now, they're often closed and not willing to talk about it.
Is it always all women, or are there some men?
We, from the very beginning, decided, because most people with eating disorders were women, to make it gender specific. Our tagline is empowering women to reclaim their lives. And
empowering women to reclaim their lives. That's lovely. Did you come up with that?
With my staff. It wasn't just me. But, we're collegial and
How big a staff do you have, by the way?
We have 500 employees in our 11 states. Probably 450 of them are clinicians. Psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, internal medicine, pediatricians, dietitians, I don't know if I mentioned that, of all disciplines that come together. We have what's called a team approach. So on a particular team that, works with, 10 patients, there'll be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, a family therapist, art therapist. Art therapy is a major component of our program. Many of these women are A-type personalities, and many of them are perfectionists and do very well. We've had Ivy League patients, of course, and from all walks of life. And they can talk their way around the therapist because they're very articulate. One way to get to the root of their issues is through art therapy. They will go into a room that's really an art room with a therapist who's trained in, or an artist who's trained in therapy. And she works with them with sculpture, with paints, with charcoal on projects. So she might say, draw a picture of yourself. Draw an outline of what you think you are on a big piece of paper. And then you could hang that on the wall and have the patient stand in front of it. And they'll see that their image of themselves is like this while they stand in the middle of it and they're like this. So then you start to process that. You ask them to draw a picture of their mother or their father. And the feelings come out about their mother, about their father in their artwork. As a matter of fact, we've had art exhibits. The Fort Lauderdale Museum of Art had us for 2 months, the art of our patients.
That's a great museum, Fort Lauderdale.
It is. And we're just at Chester Hill College with a display. We've been in Haddonfield Art Gallery. The art is incredible. And if you walk down the halls of Renfrew, all we have are patient art. That's quite incredible, with a little sort of byline and as to what the patient was feeling when she did this work of art. And it's quite amazing.
I have to ask you about the cure rate.
To get back to that, here's the thing. In mental health, it's not like a heart disease or heart problem or a kidney problem where you go in, you do the surgery, it's done. 2 people can come into Renfrew with anorexia, say, and both could be 80% of the ideal body weight. Well, one of them's had it for 10 years. One of them has just, it's happened rapidly over the last 2 years. One of them will go home to a really dysfunctional family and not continue in therapy, or go into a place, a part of the country where there aren't therapists who are expert in eating disorders. The other will go to a major metropolitan area where there's aftercare. They may go to one of our clinics in our 11 states. And then they have more of a chance of success. So how do you measure success? The problem is that we can say that between the time someone comes in and someone leaves, 85% of our patients improve. Now, we're not just talking about weight. Weight is the surface issue. We're talking about their abilities to love, to have relationships, to ultimately hold down a job, to have positive images of themselves, to, so there are many, many factors in determining healing and what healing is like with eating disorders. But we can't control what happens when people leave. So it's very hard.
They have to go back to their own lives.
Yeah, in mental health, unless the patient is inpatient full-time, from beginning to end over a couple of years, you can't tell what the long-term progress is.
Did that 10 days, the 45 days to 10 days, did it ever get extended?
It's back up to 30, and that's because we've pushed.
Okay.
I have 25 people. All they do is call insurance companies every day. Insurance companies now give us 3 days at a time. So you call in 3 days and you say, this is the progress we've made, but it's not quite enough progress. And the insurance company might say, we think it's enough progress, and they'll discharge the patient. So the big difference, pre-managed care, post-managed care, is that before managed care, a patient could come in, start to feel comfortable in the community, start to open up, and say in the beginning, it takes a week to acclimate. In the middle, for 2 weeks, they work really hard. They start to delve with the therapist. And then at the end of those couple of weeks, the therapist ties up the knots, gets them ready for going home.
Before we have to tie the knot on the show, I want people to know that there was a major documentary film that was made about Renfrew and you even got to go to Sundance when it was shown. It was nominated for an award, right?
That's true. I could say...
It was called Thin. That was the name of the documentary.
It's on HBO. I'm not exactly proud of the movie. I have to tell you why. The producer, director, came to me, and she had admitted she had an eating disorder when she was at Harvard, and she was a world-renowned photographer, but had never done a film before. And she said, I'd like to do a film about eating disorders. And after some long discussion with my clinicians and all, I gave her unfettered access to my clinic for several months. She then picked, I get 10 patients that she followed. Well, on the editing room floor, she left the 6 or 7 patients that did well, and in order to promote drama, she picked the 4 most acute patients who were not successful to, I guess, emphasize the seriousness of eating disorders, but it certainly didn't put Renfrew in a good light. We're a very warm, nurturing environment. We relate to the patient relates to us. We are very careful to help set goals with them that they buy into to improve. We don't force change. And it looked like in the movie that we were doing that. And it was dark and dreary. It seemed like all the film was filmed in the morning when we have these beautiful 10 acres, 27 acre estates. So I'm not proud of the movie. but it does highlight the seriousness.
But it raised the question, it raised the issue, and it brought it to a wide variety of people for attention.
Yeah.
So it
and we still get referrals,
yeah,
even today,
it did an important
because it did.
Yeah.
It was the first film about
I
eating
think we've
disorders.
run out of time with Sam Menaged, the CEO of the Renfrew Center. We'll have to have you back, Sam, because there's so much more to talk about. And we'll see everybody next week.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.